The Fall of Jerusalem, 1187. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem's gates opened under an agreement. There would be no authorized general massacre of the population and no unrestricted sack. Freedom, however, depended on ransom, collective funds, or the favor of someone powerful enough to intervene. Imagine the transfer from the position of a family waiting inside the walls. The city has surrendered. The conqueror has accepted terms. The danger of an assault has receded, yet the household still has to discover whether its members are included in a payment. A negotiated surrender has prevented one catastrophe while creating a line between those who can leave and those who can be taken as captives. This is the History Docket. The question is why a city burdened with sacred meaning surrendered rather than fight until it was stormed, and what restraint meant under the law and practice of medieval conquest. Jerusalem's military crisis began before Saladin reached it. At Hattin on July 4th, the Kingdom of Jerusalem lost the field force that could have relieved a siege. The details of that battle belong to another case. For this investigation, one consequence matters. Garrisons had sent men to an army that did not return. Saladin spent the following weeks reducing ports and inland positions. He did not need to capture every fortress before approaching Jerusalem. He needed to prevent a relief army from forming and to isolate the city from places still capable of resistance. Tyre held under Conrad of Montferrat, but it could not rescue Jerusalem in September. Saladin could choose when and where to concentrate. The defenders could only prepare the walls they had. Refugees entered the city as surrounding districts changed hands. Latin narratives give enormous population totals, sometimes 60,000 or more, but these are not census figures. The secure imbalance is qualitative: more mouths and more frightened civilians, with very few experienced mounted warriors. The population was not a single body of Western crusaders. It included Latin settlers, pilgrims and clergy, Eastern Christian communities, servants, poor residents, aristocratic households, and people displaced from elsewhere in the kingdom. Jewish inhabitants had been excluded under Latin rule. Their later return under Saladin belongs to the reordering after conquest, not to a claim that all three faiths occupied equal positions during the siege. Sacred geography raised the stakes. Latin Christians centered worship on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Muslims understood the Haram al-Sharif, containing the Dome of the Rock, and Al-Aqsa, as a site of profound religious importance. Under Latin rule, the dome had been used as a church, and Al-Aqsa as a royal palace before becoming associated with the Templars. A battle inside the city could damage buildings that each side wanted to control, purify, or preserve. The man who organized the defense entered Jerusalem under unusual circumstances. Balian of Ibelin had survived Hattin. He asked Saladin for safe conduct so he could remove his wife, Maria Comnena, and their family. The old French continuation associated with Ernul and the Ibelin tradition gives the fullest Latin version. It is close to Balian's family and therefore rich in detail, but favorable to his reputation. Muslim narratives also accept that Saladin released Balian from an undertaking when the city's leaders pressed him to remain. The polished chivalric gestures in later retellings should be separated from the minimum facts. Balian entered with permission, found the city without an adequate commander, notified Saladin that he could not simply depart, and was allowed to take responsibility for the defense. Saladin's consent may reflect courtesy, confidence, political calculation, or all three. The sources do not give access to a single private motive. Balian could not create a professional army. The Ernul tradition stresses the tiny number of knights and reports that he knighted selected men so that sectors could be led by persons with recognized status. Exact counts differ. What matters is that social promotion substituted imperfectly for missing military experience. Defenders allocated men along a large perimeter, repaired fortifications, gathered weapons, and prepared for sorties. Civilians must have carried materials and supplied wall crews. Siege defense could not operate otherwise. The surviving elite narratives do not let us reconstruct a named refugee's daily labor or diet. Crowding and pressure on provisions are reasonable contextual inferences from the influx, not measurements preserved in an administrative register. Balian's objective was limited. He could not destroy Saladin's field army. He could make an assault costly enough to preserve negotiation. For Saladin, Jerusalem joined devotion to politics. Imad al-Din al-Isfahani, a member of the Sultan's chancery, presents recovery of the city in ornate language of divine victory. Ibn al-Athir, writing later with wider political perspective, also makes the conquest a culminating achievement. The language is panegyrical, but the prestige was real. Saladin had mobilized a coalition around jihad and the recovery of Jerusalem. Failure after Hattin would weaken the authority he had built. The memory of 1099 was present as well. Crusaders had captured Jerusalem by assault and killed Muslim and Jewish inhabitants on a large scale. Later, Muslim writers used that memory to frame Saladin's recovery. Comparison matters, but it requires the correct legal setting. A city taken by storm was conventionally exposed to extensive claims over lives and property by the victorious army. A city that capitulated under agreed terms could secure protection in exchange for payment and surrender. The difference was not a modern rights regime, it was a negotiated restriction on what soldiers and commanders might otherwise claim. The siege began on September 20th. Here the evidence must be assembled from writers with different positions. Imad al-Din observed events from Saladin's circle and celebrates the attackers. Ernul's tradition magnifies Balian's leadership. The Libellus de Expugnacion, Terrae Sanctae, interprets the loss through Latin Christian penitence and catastrophe. Ibn al-Athir wrote later and condensed earlier material. Their sequences are not identical, but they agree that the city resisted before negotiations succeeded. Initial Ottoman-style precision would be an anachronism. This was an Ayyubid army employing familiar 12th century siege methods. Archers and stone-throwing engines pressured defenders. Troops tested sectors and met sorties. The attackers shifted their main effort toward the north and northeast, where Jerusalem lacked the steep natural protection found on other sides, and where earlier besiegers had also found approaches. Bombardment by stone throwers and work by miners did not produce an instant cinematic breach. The process was cumulative. Attackers approached under cover, damaged masonry, and threatened foundations. Defenders had to contest the ground, repair damage, and guard more wall than their trained numbers comfortably allowed. Saladin could rotate troops and supplies. Balian could not replace casualties with a relief column. The dates between September 20th and 29th matter because they show that the city was neither surrendered at first sight nor capable of indefinite resistance. For several days, the defense imposed losses and interrupted attacks. As Ayyubid forces concentrated at the vulnerable sector, mining and wall damage made a successful assault increasingly credible. The city's leverage was greatest just before that leverage disappeared. Inside, Latin sources describe processions, prayer, fasting, and penitence. Those actions were part of defense in medieval understanding, not evidence that residents abandoned practical work. They also served the author's theology. Defeat had to be explained through sin, testing, or divine judgment. We can document public religious response more securely than private emotion. The first approaches for terms did not immediately succeed. Muslim accounts present Saladin as initially unwilling to negotiate because he expected to take the city. Some versions make him swear to recover Jerusalem by the same method through which Christians had seized it. Such set speeches and vows belong to literary shaping. The secure point is that the bargaining position changed as both sides demonstrated what continued fighting would cost. The famous threat attributed to Balian appears in Arabic traditions. Ibn al-Athir gives a forceful account. If denied terms, the defenders would destroy wealth and sacred sites, kill Muslim captives and their own dependents, and fight to the death. Imad al-Din likewise frames the negotiations from within Saladin's victorious camp, though details and rhetorical emphasis differ. These are not transcripts from a conference room. The threat should therefore be described as Saladin's side remembered or justified the turn toward agreement. Its full execution was doubtful. Balian could not guarantee that frightened residents would kill their families or that every holy building could be demolished before entry. Yet negotiation depends on credible risk, not proof that every threatened act can be completed. Street fighting, the deaths of Muslim prisoners, damage to the haram, and casualties among attackers were plausible enough to reduce the value of an assault. Saladin also faced constraints within his coalition. Soldiers expected reward. Commanders and jurists interpreted the rights generated by resistance and surrender. The Sultan wanted a religious triumph, revenue, discipline, and an inhabitable city. We cannot separate sincere restraint from those incentives because the sources themselves present them together. Agreement converted the population from inhabitants exposed to storm capture into persons covered by ransom terms. Accounts agree broadly on 10 dinars for a man and 5 for a woman, but give 1 or 2 for a child depending on the source. Those figures come through medieval narratives, not a surviving complete fiscal roll, and accounts disagree over deadlines and collective arrangements. The categories also warn against reading the bargain as equal evacuation. Legal freedom was priced according to status categories created by conquest. Before examining the payments, the military leverage behind them deserves one final reconstruction. The attack sector north of the city had historical precedent. The ground allowed engines and troops to approach more readily than the steep valleys east and south. Saladin's army did not need to surround every foot of wall with equal density. It needed to hold the exits, prevent communication, and concentrate labor where masonry and terrain offered opportunity. Imad al-Din describes fierce fighting and the attacker's progress in language designed to magnify victory. The libellus emphasizes the defender's penitence and near despair. Ernul's tradition puts Balian at the center of successful resistance. Read together, they suggest repeated assaults and sorties rather than one uninterrupted push. Defenders could inflict local losses, but they could not prevent the besiegers from returning with fresh crews. Mining was especially important as bargaining pressure. Medieval miners sought to undermine a wall or tower by excavating beneath it, supporting the cavity with timber, and then burning or removing those supports. The sources do not provide an engineering survey of Jerusalem's breach. They do report enough progress for defenders to believe entry was approaching. That belief, rather than a measurable percentage of wall stability, explains the timing of serious talks. The defenders' own sorties served 2 purposes. They disrupted work and showed that Saladin could not enter without casualties. Their success was necessarily temporary. Every man lost mattered more inside a city with no relief army. By late September, Balian's bargaining position rested on the capacity to make the last assault destructive, not on a realistic chance of winning the siege. Custom also shaped the negotiation. Medieval commanders did not follow a single universal siege code, but the distinction between capitulation and storm capture was widely intelligible. If defenders surrendered before forcible entry, a commander could promise life, establish ransom, and reserve property under terms. If soldiers took a resisting city, expectations of booty and captives were stronger. Commanders could still restrain troops, and practice varied, but Balian was negotiating before the legal and practical basis for restraint narrowed. This helps explain Saladin's initial refusal and later agreement without inventing a change of heart. Early in the siege, accepting generous terms might sacrifice rewards when capture seemed imminent. After Balian demonstrated continued resistance and threatened destruction, agreement offered a more predictable victory. The sacred sites would survive, the city would transfer intact, ransom would produce revenue, and the army would avoid a costly fight through breached defenses. The settlement also had to be enforceable. Balian and leading clergy needed enough authority to stop resistance and organize payment. Saladin needed enough authority to prevent soldiers from treating the city as stormed. Their earlier contact and mutual recognition mattered because both sides required an intermediary able to deliver a population, not merely speak for himself. Collective money complicated the schedule. The Ransom Ibelin tradition emphasizes Balian's efforts for the poor and reports negotiation over a lump sum. Imad al-Din records releases and gifts in a way that displays generosity within Saladin's camp. The treasury connected with the Holy Sepulchre is said in Latin accounts to have contributed. Patriarch Heraclius becomes a contested figure, praised for church leadership in some telling and condemned in others for leaving with wealth while poorer residents remained. Those accusations are evidence of social anger, but not a reliable inventory of what he carried or whom he could have freed. Ransom was neither a fine imposed on citizens in a continuing legal order nor simply a ticket price. It was the payment by which a person who might otherwise be treated as a captive obtained release under the capitulation. Collective funds and elite advocacy could extend that protection to people without individual means. They did not cover everyone. The human sequence should be placed here, immediately after the terms, because this is where the agreement became individual fate. People were registered, payments were collected, and groups departed under supervision. Some were freed through collective ransom, some through gifts attributed to Saladin, his brother Al-Adil, or commanders, some through personal wealth. Medieval writers produce totals for these groups and for those remaining enslaved, but the calculations do not reconcile. It is safer to say that many obtained freedom and many did not. The evidence documents captivity, sale, and family separation as consequences of the surrender. Imad al-Din writes triumphantly about women and captives in language that is both evidence of enslavement and a display of conquest for his audience. Latin traditions emphasize the poor left behind and criticize elites. Neither gives a representative survey. Sexual vulnerability is inherent in medieval enslavement and present in conquest rhetoric, but individual cases should not be invented when the record is silent. Different groups encountered the terms through different institutions. A knight or noble might be covered by a personal agreement, an exchange, or a patron's payment. Clergy could draw on church property and communal connections. Refugees who had arrived recently might lack both local assets and relatives able to help. Native Greek, Syrian, or Jacobite and other Eastern Christian residents were generally permitted to remain under Ayyubid rule in subordinate taxed status. The capitulation's evacuation and ransom machinery chiefly governed the Latin or Frankish population and refugees, although exact implementation varies by source. The reported price difference among men, women, and children did not measure human worth in a philosophical sense. It was a fiscal classification used to calculate release. A household's problem was cumulative. Even the lowest individual rate could become impossible when applied to several dependents. This is why collective funds mattered and why aggregate claims remained so contentious. A chronicler favorable to Balian could count people his negotiation liberated. A court panegyrist could count people Saladin released as gifts. A hostile Latin writer could concentrate on those left behind. Routes after departure were uncertain. Some groups moved toward the coast under escort or supervision. Latin sources describe difficulty at destinations already strained by refugees. We can document displacement and loss of property more securely than the daily treatment of every departing group. The surrender guaranteed release to those covered. It did not restore homes, income, or political membership in the conquered city. For those not covered, enslavement was a legal status imposed through conquest. It could involve sale, household labor, transfer among owners, ransom at a later date, or movement far from Jerusalem. Sources celebrate or lament groups rather than trace representative life histories. The responsible human account keeps these possibilities grounded in the institution without assigning one fate to every captive. The poor are prominent in the moral memory because their position tested every claim of generosity. Saladin and members of his family are credited with freeing groups, while Balian and Heraclius are credited with raising money. Yet every act of release presupposed people over whom the conqueror claimed a right. Charity mitigated the system case by case. It did not abolish that claim. On October 2nd, the city was transferred. Native Greek, Syrian, or Jacobite, and other Eastern Christian residents generally remained under Ayyubid sovereignty in subordinate taxed status, while the evacuation and ransom process chiefly applied to Latin or Frankish inhabitants and refugees. The date coincided with the anniversary in the Islamic calendar as understood by contemporaries of the Prophet's night journey according to some later discussion, but sources should not be forced into proving a carefully staged anniversary. The importance of the day lies in the orderly change of control. Muslim worship returned to the Haram al-Sharif. The cross on the Dome of the Rock was removed. Al-Aqsa, which had served Latin royal and Templar uses, was cleansed and prepared as a mosque. Imad al-Din presents these acts as restoration after desecration. The language reveals the victor's religious claim. The physical changes are also well attested. The Holy Sepulchre was not destroyed. Christian worship continued under new political authority, with communities negotiating access and status. Jewish settlement was permitted again after exclusion under Latin rule. These developments should not be turned into a scene of modern pluralist equality. They were arrangements made under Muslim sovereignty, with taxes, legal distinctions, and communal hierarchies. Claims that nobody was harmed during the transfer are too absolute. Armies and crowded evacuations cannot be audited person by person. The defensible comparative statement is institutional. Saladin accepted a capitulation, enforced broad limits on plunder, and did not authorize the general killing associated with a stormed city. That result saved lives. It also preserved claims to ransom and enslavement. The competing portraits of Saladin can now be tested against the mechanism rather than against presumed intention. The chivalric portrait points to his acceptance of terms, releases without payment, protection of sacred places, and restraint compared with 1,099. The calculating ruler portrait points to the military cost of an assault, the political value of an intact Jerusalem, income from ransom, and the need to manage coalition expectations. The evidence does not compel a choice between them. A ruler can act through devotion, reputation, and advantage in the same decision. The comparison with 1099 also has limits. The Crusaders in 1099 entered after an assault. Saladin in 1187 accepted surrender. Different operational outcomes created different customary claims before the moral character of individual commanders is considered. At the same time, Saladin actively chose to negotiate when he could continue attacking, and his command had to make restraint effective. Context explains the difference without emptying his decision of agency. Latin and Arabic authors then amplified the contrast for their own communities. Latin Christians used the loss to demand penitence and explain divine abandonment. Muslim court writers used restraint and restoration to demonstrate the quality of Saladin's rule. Their agreement that there was no general massacre is strong evidence. Their exact totals and speeches remain arguments within that agreement. One group rarely centered in these elite narratives is the Muslim captive population already inside Jerusalem. Balian's reported threat made those prisoners bargaining assets. Their presence reminds us that the city's residents and defenders also held people by force. The negotiation reduced the risk to them while transferring captivity onto other inhabitants. This does not create moral equivalence. It completes the map of coercion within the walls. Balian's reputation needs the same discipline. The Ibelin-connected tradition gives him the central role, and his leadership was plainly important. He organized a defense after the field army had vanished and secured terms before the wall failed. That achievement did not make him a modern humanitarian or the sole voice of the population. His leverage included a reported threat of extreme violence, and the settlement he obtained preserved the inequalities of ransom. The immediate strategic consequence was the loss of the kingdom's principal sacred and political city. Resistance elsewhere continued, but Jerusalem could no longer expect restoration from its own field army. News of the conquest moved rapidly through Christian and Muslim worlds. That is sufficient aftermath for this case. The campaigns that followed have their own causes and decisions. The verdict begins with Hattin, but does not end there. Destruction of the relief army made Jerusalem's military position desperate. The siege converted that weakness into an approaching breach. Balian's defense then created a short interval in which Saladin could still prefer agreement to assault. The resulting restraint was real because the terms limited killing and plunder that could have followed storm capture. It was conditional because protection was distributed through payment, collective funds, patronage, and status. The evidence does not reveal how much of Saladin's decision came from mercy and how much from military, religious, economic, or political advantage. It shows that those motives converged on negotiation. Jerusalem therefore escaped a general sack without escaping conquest. A family able to leave would experience the bargain differently from one divided by unpaid ransom. Both experiences belong to the same surrender. How should restraint be judged? By comparison with the violence avoided, by the incentives of the victor, or by the fate of the least protected person under the terms?